Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take a whole stack of information and really pull out the most important bits for you.
That's right.
Today, we are jumping into something pretty complex, and it keeps changing. The expectations, the realities around a potential peace in Ukraine. We're going to look at how different predictions for, say, a ceasefire have really shaken up economic forecasts and, diplomatic moves.
And our goal today is really to help you get a handle on the different viewpoints, the factors underneath it all when people talk about ending the conflict.
Yeah.
It's crucial to see how the hopes for the economy, what politicians are saying, and the actual, back and forth of negotiations all kind of weave together.
Definitely. So, okay, let's start at the beginning, sort of, with that initial optimism.
Right.
For Ukraine, there was this, pretty significant expectation, wasn't there? A potential ceasefire by mid-2025.
Yeah, and what's really interesting there is how that specific date, mid-2025, it wasn't just a guess. It actually became the foundation for, pretty much all economic predictions for Ukraine.
Ah, okay. So it was baked into the numbers.
Exactly. It was seen as this really positive turning point, a boost for the economy, a chance to rebuild.
But, here's the twist, right?
Yeah.
That optimism. It's shifted.
It really has.
We're now hearing, and this is from a pretty high-level source in the Ukrainian president's office, that those positive economic hopes tied to a truce, they're largely gone, at least for right now.
Yeah, that's a big shift. And if you look at the bigger picture, the whole focus has moved away from, projecting growth to just basically keeping the Ukrainian economy afloat. That's the term being used.
It's treading water.
Pretty much. Now, there's still some hope that maybe a truce could help the economy in 2026, looking further out.
Okay.
But the immediate reality, it really highlights how much Ukraine is depending on Western support financially and militarily. It's about survival now, keeping basic functions going.
And it seems like big investment plans are scarce, too. We saw that mineral resources deal signed with the U.S.
Right, the resources agreement.
But that's still a long way off from actually happening, it sounds like.
Exactly. It just shows how tough it is to get long-term investment going when things are so uncertain day to day.
Speaking of the U.S., U.S. President Trump's comments about ending the conflict quickly, they definitely stirred the pot, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. His statements seem to have a real impact on those shifting expectations we were talking about.
So what was the actual effect? What did we see happen?
Well, it's interesting. After U.S. President Trump talked about a swift settlement, you saw business people, both inside Ukraine and outside, get pretty optimistic about peace dividends.
Peace dividends, meaning they expected a boom.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
An economic upswing, investment flowing in, the kind of thing you'd expect after a major conflict ends. And based on that hope, Ukrainian government bonds, their price shot up.
Right, I remember seeing that. Mid-February, they hit around 70 cents on the dollar.
Exactly, which is, a huge jump from early 2022 when they were down below 15 cents.
Wow. So investors were suddenly willing to pay 70 cents for debt they previously valued at less than 15. That's a massive swing in confidence.
Huge. It was all about that hope for a quick peace dividend, a belief Ukraine could pay its debts. Ukrainian debt actually became a, quote, leader in yield.
Meaning high risk, high reward.
Precisely. A big market bet on a fast resolution. But as we know, that hope didn't last long.
Yeah, the Washington Post pointed out those hopes kind of fell apart when U.S. President Trump's attention seemed to move elsewhere.
That's right. And you see it reflected starkly in the market data. Bloomberg, which had highlighted that yield leadership, later reported that as the chances of U.S. President Trump actually delivering on that quick resolution seemed less certain, investors, they had to pull back.
So the market corrected.
Sharply. Bloomberg estimated that just in 2025, those Ukrainian dollar bonds actually caused investors losses of over 10%.
Ouch. So a quick reversal based on perceived political shifts.
It really shows how sensitive markets are to this geopolitical talk right now. Almost like every statement gets priced in immediately.
Okay, let's broaden out the timeline a bit. It's not just one prediction for when this might end, is it? We're hearing different things from different places.
Definitely not just one voice. You've got, for instance, the IMF. Their updated baseline scenario projects the conflict ending in the later months of 2025.
Okay, so aligning with that earlier Ukrainian hope, roughly.
Roughly, yes. And this is but they immediately add that the risks are still exceptionally high.
Right.
The timing for peace is really unclear, and things like international support, financial and military could change things dramatically.
And the IMF also adjusted Ukraine's growth forecast downwards, didn't they?
They did, down by 0.5 percentage point for 2025 and almost a full point for 2026.
So growth in 2025 is now looking like maybe 2-3% at the low end.
Yeah, and they pointed to specific reasons like lower steel exports and needing more coal imports because the Pokrovsk mine closed. These details really matter for the overall picture.
And inflation.
The IMF sees it around 9% end of 2025, maybe easing to 7% by the end of 2026. So it's a cautious outlook.
Okay, so that's the IMF view.
Yeah.
Then you have Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky himself saying he expects it to end in 2025.
Right, which is a more definitive political statement, perhaps aimed at projecting confidence or resolve. It aligns with some earlier hopes.
And on the other side, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that Russia wants the conflict to end, stressing the need to find effective paths to peace.
Yes, that's been his consistent message.
And then there's U.S. President Trump. He initially promised to end it quickly.
Famously, yes, though he later said there was some sarcasm in that.
Right. And more recently, in June, he mentioned seeing small progress, but didn't really elaborate.
So yeah, you get this whole range of statements, desires, predictions, each potentially carrying its own strategic weight.
Which brings us to the diplomatic track. What's actually happening with negotiations? Are they talking?
Well, we know they have resumed talks at certain points. That's a concrete thing. Our information points to 2 rounds in Istanbul, back on May 16th and June 2nd. And during those, they actually exchanged memos with ceasefire proposals.
So documents were traded. There was a formal process, even if it's not always visible.
Exactly. But Russian President Vladimir Putin described those documents as diametrically opposite.
Meaning fundamentally different visions for peace.
Pretty much. But, interestingly, she also stressed that negotiations are still necessary to find a solution. So, acknowledging the gap, but keeping the door open for talks.
So who's responsible for the pace? Or the lack of pace? We're hearing conflicting things there, too.
We are. You have the U.S. Special Envoy, Kit Kellogg, saying very clearly that any claim the U.S. or Ukraine are delaying talks is just baseless.
He used strong language, calling Peskov's comments Orwellian.
Yes, implying a twisting of facts. Kellogg urged for an immediate ceasefire and 3-way talks, saying Russia cannot continue to stall. So placing the blame for delays squarely on Russia.
Okay. And from the Russian side, Dmitry Peskov, Russian President Putin's press secretary.
Peskov said the Kremlin expects clarity on preparing for talks with Ukraine in the nearest future. So, suggesting they're waiting for something or expecting movement.
And didn't Peskov link future talks to prisoner exchanges?
He did indicate earlier that a date for a third Istanbul round would depend on prisoner exchanges being completed. Though, interestingly, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced Russia was ready for that third round the very next day after Peskov said that.
A slight disconnect, perhaps. Or just timing.
Hard to say for sure. Peskov also tied speeding up the talks to Ukraine's position and, significantly, how effective Washington's mediation is perceived to be.
So preconditions and pointing fingers about who's holding things up seems like part of the process itself.
It often is. Accusations about delay can be a tactic in themselves, questioning the other side's real commitment.
Okay, stepping back even further, what about the wider geopolitical context?
Right.
NATO, for instance. What are we hearing from within the alliance?
Well, one notable voice has been Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He's asserted that, in his view, a majority within NATO believes a direct clash between the alliance and Russia would mean World War III.
A stark warning.
Very. And something to be avoided at all costs, according to him. He specifically flagged the risk if NATO intervened directly for Ukraine.
And he also raised concerns about Ukraine joining NATO.
Yes, he suggested that Ukraine joining NATO would, in his opinion, lead to a permanent state of conflict with Russia, which he thinks should be avoided. It shows there are definitely different perspectives and anxieties within NATO itself about escalation.
And from the Russian perspective on NATO?
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has put forward an interesting idea suggesting that the huge increases in defense spending by NATO countries might actually, paradoxically, lead to the alliance's collapse.
How so? Like an economic strain?
That seems to be the implication, highlighting a potential long-term sustainability issue for NATO, perhaps, beyond just the immediate military calculations. It's another angle on the pressures facing the alliance.
So pulling all these threads together, it's incredibly complex, isn't it?
It really is. This deep dive shows just how complicated and, frankly, contradictory many of the expectations and statements are surrounding the conflict.
You've got economic forecasts swinging wildly based on political words.
Right. Then you have the actual diplomacy, which seems to be happening in fits and starts, with deep disagreements.
And all overlaid by these bigger geopolitical anxieties about escalation or alliance stability.
Exactly. It paints this picture of a situation that's constantly shifting, with absolutely no easy answers about how or even when a resolution might come about.
And the real challenge for anyone trying to follow this is figuring out which statements, which actions are actually moving things towards peace, and what underlying motives are driving everything we hear.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how all these different predictions and diplomatic postures are actually influencing the decisions leaders and markets are making right now, even while that path to peace looks so uncertain.
It's a critical question.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.